Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damon.
And welcome back to a podcast that asks interesting questions that don't have any answers with your host, Ben Siders, that's me, and the other guy is Kirk Damon. We are intellectual property lawyers and certified geek practicing law in St. Louis, Missouri. You can find me, Ben, on Twitter at Benjamin Siders. You can find Kirk at KirkDMN. And you can follow this podcast on Twitter at LGGPod. For today's edamame episode, Kirk and I are going to speculate wildly. This is one of those episodes where we do have an answer. The interesting question is, what would we do differently with the Star Wars sequels if we were put in charge of it? And we have answers. I recorded mine a couple days ago. I think Kirk recorded his before that. I have not listened to Kirk's yet, but I will not be surprised if it's similar to my own. So we'll get to that. I'm going to put my thoughts in first, and then Kirk's, and then come back and wrap it up. You know, in my perfect world, where I don't have to worry about focus groups and selling movie tickets and things like that, I probably would have gone in a completely different direction. I probably would not have started where they started by bringing back all the old actors and then telling a new story again the exact same way. So that's the first. I understand why they did what they did, but Episode 7 was just a soft reboot to Episode 1, bridging the gap from the old cast to the new cast. And I get the impression, and maybe I'm wrong, that the idea was to introduce these new characters for a whole sequence of films, but that's not going to happen. But that's all Episode 7 really had to do is reintroduce a next generation to the Star Wars universe, and it did that successfully. But it just rehashed the first episode without taking a lot of risks. You can just kind of see it in the structure of the story that they really didn't know how to get to Star Wars outside of the framework of the outgunned rebellion fighting against the big evil empire. And the way they did that was to just say, oh, we have this first order without really telling us what it is or where it came from, other than it's the empire still. It's got an evil guy that has, evil wizard powers in a dark suit and a mask. So you've got your Darth Vader. He doesn't fully get along with the conventional military guys he works with. They've built a super weapon. They're trying to control the galaxy. And just as in the opening strokes of Star Wars, the Emperor dissolves the Senate. In A Force Awakens, they just obliterate the entire Republic capital. It's all the same broad narrative strokes with some of the personalities rearranged. You've still got your Force-sensitive protagonist who doesn't really understand her heritage, growing up basically isolated on a desert planet. The Obi-Wan Kenobi role is kind of replaced by Han Solo. The Han Solo role is kind of replaced by Poe Dameron. And it all kind of follows on. As I was watching Episode 7, I remember thinking, it's just the same thing again. I mean, it's well done, but it's just the same thing again. So I would not have gone that way with it. It was fun to watch, but at the end of the day, in hindsight, I did not find the characters or the storylines in the sequel all that interesting or compelling. And I think it's because I've seen these characters before. I've been told this story before. I know how it's going to end. I wasn't gripped by it. It didn't capture my imagination the way that the original trilogy did. If you're going to bring the old cast back, they're all 30 years older, or 40 years older, so you have to set it in an appropriate time frame. But I would have made them more in the background. I would have had Luke kind of in the Obi-Wan role as the wise old Jedi master who's training the new generation. I would have not had the whole thing where there's no Force. Again, that's going back to Episode 4, where there aren't a whole lot of Jedi. The whole Jedi Temple thing, or the Jedi Academy never took off. It's all been destroyed, and there's nobody who can use the Force. I wonder if maybe they didn't want to have sort of a fledgling new Jedi council or a group of young Jedi, because it would feel too much like the prequels, and that just didn't go over well, and they wanted to get away from that concept. But I think you could still have it be something where Luke struck a balance in between, where he started a temple but only trained a very, very small handful of Jedi, working closely with them. And really, I mean, there's a lot you could have done with the story of how he prevents things from getting out of balance again. And I would not have separated Han and Leia. Last saw them at the end of Return of the Jedi, and it was a happy ending. Then we find out that it wasn't happy after all. I would have kind of had those characters all be in the backdrop. In fact, what I would have done is made references to the Zahn novels to establish that those were also part of the canon, and then introduce some of those characters, play off of that. There's a lot that could have been done with that. Grand Admiral Thrawn is in some of the cartoons. I don't know why they didn't do that, but I would have had our main characters sort of be generally approaching retirement and sort of taking a back seat and being more mentors for a new cast of younger characters who are facing a different kind of threat. Maybe an adult, offspring of Han and Leia be in the Jedi training, have a Ben Solo. That part was nice. His name was Ben. That made sense. Luke was training him. That made sense. And then have the story be about his temptation and fall to the dark side, where there's some force attacking the Republic. It's still been only maybe it's been only 15 years since the mopping up action against the Empire. There's still pockets of resistance from the Empire. There's political division from within the rebellion on what to do. It's hard to make all these worlds work together. There's a story that you could tell there that would be, I think, more interesting than now there's another rebellion and another empire. So that's step one. I think the positions and the roles that the original cast occupied was a little too prominent. Second major thing I would have done differently, and so I'm going to assume that they ignored my first thing and made the movie that they made. The second thing I would have done differently is in episode 8, I think I've said this before, I think the biggest mistake they made is having that start so fast on the heels of episode 7. We really needed to have a little time for the characters to have some off-screen development to resituate themselves in the story where we need them to be to continue the story. Conceptually, episode 8 is basically the same movie as 7. I mean, it starts like 5 minutes later. That timing is awkward and doesn't really work. It further constricts the timeline of Rey's development with the Force, which was already pretty compressed. I think we did time to let Rey and Finn and Poe, let those characters all breathe a little bit off screen and figure out where they needed to be in the story. Where does the story need to go? What direction do we want these characters to grow in? And then start moving them in that direction. But since 8 started so quickly after 7 in terms of the internal timeline of the story, that opportunity was just never there. And that's in part because of how 7 left us on a cliffhanger with Rey handing that lightsaber to Luke. So I think if they had let some time pass, it doesn't have to be a lot of time, but at least, 3-6 months, maybe a year between the end of 7 and the beginning of 8, and then they can reintroduce us to the narrative where, we can reinsert ourselves into the story at a sensible place, as opposed to having it basically chosen for us. And that choice was basically made by J.J. Abrams in 7 with that final scene. We pretty much had to pick up there. And my third point, and probably the most important that really plays into all of these, is I just don't understand at all how they could sit down and plan a 3-movie Star Wars narrative without actually planning a 3-movie Star Wars narrative. They didn't make J.J. sit down and figure out where his story was going and develop the whole arc. And while there are a lot of movies where you can get away with not paying attention to the details, geek cultures are not among them. You can't gloss over that stuff in Star Wars. You can't gloss over it in Star Trek. Those details are what makes those movies what they are. By not doing that work up front, I feel like Disney just fundamentally didn't understand. To some extent, had the opposite mistake George Lucas made with the prequels. It felt like Disney just didn't understand what makes Star Wars Star Wars. And they just made bland science fiction adventure movies set in this universe without really any fidelity to the details of the world building that the nerds love. They don't have to do that. They're free to do what they want, but I think that's why, if you're a big Star Wars fan, that's one of the reasons why the sequels, although they're well-made films, and I found them entertaining, just didn't grab you the way that a traditional Star Wars movie did. And it's not just because we saw them when we were kids and they were part of our childhood. I think it's because they just didn't have that attention to detail. So that's my thoughts on that. On the subject of Lucas, I think the prequels also showed that George Lucas didn't fully understand what made Star Wars work, and that some of the limitations in terms of budget and technology that he had to work around in the original movies helped make those movies what they are. Lucas's strength is a creative visionary. The man's ability to just conceive of just goofball out there ideas is remarkable, but not all of them are filmable. Not all of them are suitable for translation into an organized, coherent narrative. And what we saw with the prequels is when those technological and budgetary and editorial limitations were lifted, we got a mess that nobody really was able to take and shape and mold. And at the end of the day, what's the verdict on Star Wars? You've got Episode 4, which was lightning in a bottle, and it was a movie that could have potentially been terrible, but it was saved by brilliant editing, a soundtrack, pretty much that. I'll put it in the show notes, but there's a great video of how Star Wars was originally cut, and then how it was recut to make the narrative flow better, and a lot of the stuff that was left on the cutting room floor is the kind of just juvenile, almost infantile comedic antics we saw in the prequels. And, some of George's more questionable filmmaking and narrative impulses were there from the beginning, but they were cut out in Star Wars. So you've got that film, which is sort of like I said, lightning in a bottle, a convergence of fortunate events and the right people with the right talents at the right time. And then you've got Empire Strikes Back, also a fantastic film on its own, original screenplay by I think Lee Brackett, not George Lucas, not even Lawrence Kasdan. Brackett was an old pulp sci-fi writer from she may have been writing 30 or 40 years before Empire Strikes Back. She put the narrative framework in place. I think Lawrence Kasdan also had a hand in that script, and that is, by any reasonable standard, the best of the films. You've got Return of the Jedi, which the rescue of Han Solo is a fun set piece that takes about 45 minutes. And then there's a lot of not much. We have Luke's confrontation, and then the whole thing on Endor was just to give Han and Leia and Chewie and the droid something to do because their stories were pretty much done. So, Jedi's kind of a mixed up mess of a story. The prequels, of course, were not great, and the sequels were well made, but also uninspired. So 11 films, you've got one really standout film in Empire Strikes Back, and you've got one really sort of groundbreaking film in Star Wars, and then a whole lot of films ranging from just terrible to well done but not amazing, and that's where we are. So on some level, sometimes it kind of feels like the greatness of Star Wars has really just been coasting on the back of a couple of good films, and combined with childhood nostalgia and then all the extended universe stuff that we've all enjoyed. It definitely captured our imaginations, but I guess the best way I can say it is it captured our imaginations, but that hasn't translated into imaginativeness or creativity in the other films. If nothing else, Lucas at least tried to do something kind of different with the prequels, and then in the sequels just played it safe, stayed as far away from that as possible, and just went right back to that same well. And anyway, so those are my hot takes on what I would have done differently with the sequel trilogy. One, position the legacy cast differently in the narrative. Two, give more breathing room to the new cast members between films. And then three, plan this out better from the start. Have an idea of what kind of story you want to tell and where it's going. The lack of narrative and creative direction in the sequels really just made it feel like a sequence of scenes involving characters and nothing really tying it all together. Those are my thoughts. I'm going to kick it over to Kirk now and see what he thinks.
I am back again for another Edamame episode. Another one of our short podcasts where I talk to my phone and Ben is not here. For those of you who may be getting tired of these, we'll hopefully end up in the studio here eventually and can actually integrate and talk with each other. I know Ben's have been a little more fun than mine have. I think he can actually play guitar and so has managed to incorporate his guitar in some of the prior episodes. I can't do that. I could incorporate the piano into mine, but I don't necessarily see that as being potentially valuable. So anyway, we're just going to talk about sort of a few more things. This is definitely a nerdy one. We're going to talk about sort of the nerdy things, and it's a topic that Ben proposed. I know he's going to probably do one of these things with it, but the basic topic was, what would we have done differently if we were the ones who were, essentially executive producing the Star Wars sequels? So we get to produce episodes 7, 8, and 9 and decide what they are going to be. What would we have done differently than what happened? And this rose out of it. I think it's a great comment. We obviously had some gripes in conjunction with them, but what would we have done differently? I looked at this question and said, I think it's interesting. It's always fun to sort of take these hypotheticals as to what it is. But my answer became very clear to me, very quickly. I think the number one thing that I would have done is I would have had a coherent 3-story arc. I think I would have had all 3 scripts written at once to be one coherent story, so that the three movies flowed directly into each other. I definitely grew up in the age of syndication, watching television, which was not something that, necessarily flowed. You had 2-part episodes, the to be continued infamous episodes, from 1 and 2, but most part episodes stood alone. You had a basic portion of it. I know we've talked about this previously, discussion with Star Trek, that Star Trek episodes stand alone. They're not something you need to watch in order. You can readily watch them out of order. Now, there are certain things that obviously happen in season 1, which are referred to in season 2, and so on, but for the most part, they are not episodes that you need to see. There are also obviously 2-part episodes, the idea of the end of season cliffhanger to be continued, and obviously 2-part episodes, even during the course of an individual season. But I think the creation, definitely one of my favorite science fiction shows ever, Babylon 5. I think Babylon 5 started the idea that you can have an entire season be coherent and be a coherent story. It was obviously written as a 5-year arc. When he wrote it, he had a plan of what each year was going to be. I always think the great thing about Babylon 5, and I understand it did win it, was nominated and did win it. Season 3 was nominated for the Hugo Award for science fiction, which the issue was it had to be one episode or one multi-episode continuous arc. So you could nominate a classic 2-part episode. And season 3 was nominated as one arc. And as far as I know, it was actually nominated and did actually win. I may be wrong about that. But that's sort of my understanding. So I think that show dramatically changed the way we looked at television. That said, we can't now have these ongoing arcs. And I think television today basically says we do have these ongoing arcs. These things are not standalone. Now, in movies, I think you still have more of a standalone feel. I think even if we were to take the Marvel Universe movies, which obviously interconnect, they still also stand alone as movies. While they have interconnecting components, they definitely stand alone as movies. You can watch them out of order, except for probably, Infinity War, and the end sagas of it, without having necessarily a problem, or, even watching ones about individuals. So you could probably watch the Thor movies out of order without, them necessarily not being entertaining, without you not necessarily understanding what's going on. So I think we do need to look at the idea that movies need to be a little bit different than television. Television, I think, has a much more less serialized format now, with the idea that says, hey, we can place everything in order, and have an entire season basically be one very long episode. Whereas movies, even to the extent that they try to have a continuous storyline, they have some individual standalone nature of it, much more so. But I do think that that's really what Star Wars, the sequels, really had the problem with, is they just didn't have a coherent storyline. I think certain of the people got very into the storyline of Episode 7. I, for one, particularly like the storyline of Episode 8, but, Episode 9 didn't necessarily play off of Episode 8. Episode 8 did not necessarily play off of Episode 7. Episode 9 did not necessarily play off Episode 7. And so I think it's one of those where you really had trouble of sort of what was going on, where was this going, and it was supposed to be a story arc. I think when you look at, the original Star Wars movies, again, New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, Episode 4, 5, and 6. Obviously, Episode 4 was designed to be a standalone movie. It was never intended to be anything else. But I think Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi obviously sort of flow together a little bit better while also still being standalone movies. I really would have seen this as flow, much more. And so that's, I think, my number one comment of if I had to do, and I get to be, supreme overlord of the Star Wars universe, I would have made it that, hey, we're going to write all 3 of these scripts together. They're going to be a coherent story. Yes, each is going to be a standalone movie, but we're going to go towards a clear endpoint as to what it is. So that's my number 1. My number 2, and I think I had actually commented in repeated episodes of this podcast previously, I really hoped they would end the Star Wars saga. And I think that's one of the things that I would have done, or ended the Skywalker saga, I should say, not the Star Wars saga. I really would have liked it to have been a definitive ending, that these characters are not going to continue. This is the end of this arc. I really kind of see it as hey, this is a 9-movie arc, which we can look at and say this is a defining moment in the Star Wars universe. But that is what it is. It is a moment. It's a single war, if you want to look at it sort of being that way. Now, maybe we look at it and say there's a prequel and a lead up to that war, which is even its own war, the Clone Wars. You then have the, sort of rebellion coming out of that, the fall of the Republic and the formation of the Empire. And then in the group of three, you have the sort of then fall of the Empire. I think in 3, I would have made it much more the idea that we have a potential sort of rebirth of the Empire, or the idea of mopping up the Empire. But the Empire coming back, whether we call it First Order, whether we call it the Empire, whatever you want to call it, but that it's sort of not dead yet. A zombie coming back. But then at the end of episode 9, I think it would have been something where, no, it is now dead. This is not continuing. I think we could have left open, yes, there can be more Sith. We can have, the continuation of Jedis, that, balance must be maintained. But for purposes of this, the Skywalker saga is over. The Skywalker family is no longer the defining moment behind this. And I think that's the real thing about episodes, 1 through 9. Again, sort of, I think the core of Star Wars, and the Star Wars universe is the story of one family. It's the stories of the Skywalker family, which end up on both sides of the equation, which end up, causing more, trauma to the universe than any one family should be capable of doing. But that's what they do. And that's why, again, I look at it and say, this is a defining moment of the universe, but it needed to end. And we could then have stuff in the future where it would be, hey, remember that time in the past, where this was, where this happened, where the Empire was formed, where we had this, isn't that great that that's over? But, yet we still have to hunt down Sith Lords. There are those who want to bring back the Empire. But it would, if we wanted to do another major arc, it would be something that would be its own arc, own characters, even if it's based in the same universe. So definitely that's my number 2, is I would have, like I said, number 1, I would have had a coherent storyline across all 3 movies, and that coherent storyline would have led it to an end, and that end would be an end. It would really be the end of the Skywalker saga as part of it. And I sort of theorized that they potentially would go this way, not really thinking they would. I would not have any Skywalker survive. I think it would be something where it's, nope, that's going to be over. We're going to end this sort of family dynasty, and that would be a definitive part of the ending. So anyway, I think those are the primary things that I would change in the course of looking at it. I think there's some things I would have kept the same. I would have liked to have multiple directors across the 3 movies, just to give each one a slightly different feel, to see sort of what it is, and much, again, the same way that we saw in Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. I think I would have kept some of the elements of it that I thought were very good. I think I'm one of the few people that kind of appreciated the explanation of how the Sith work at the end of Last Skywalker. While I found it a little bit unsatisfying, I did appreciate the fact that they were at least trying to do it and sort of explain the other half. We had some ideas of what the Jedi are, but the idea of what actually is the Sith, what are the Dark Jedi, and where do they come from? I like the idea of the ambiguity, and I don't think they played off it nearly enough. The idea of Luke not necessarily believing in the Jedi Order anymore, and the idea that maybe balance in the Force is obtained by not having black and white, but by having gray. So we don't have Sith and Jedi in conjunction with it, but instead what we have is this idea of this gray order in between, which is both. I think that's something that could be very well played on, and the idea that, hey, there may be a separation, there may be a coming together. I think that's one of the things I would have had. One other thing I think I would have done differently, and I know this is probably going to be a little bit controversial, I would have done a better job of tying up some of the stuff from the prequels. I actually thought there were some good ideas in the prequels. Many of them were poorly executed, but I thought there were some good ideas. Sorry, midichlorians, no, you're not included in my things that I would have liked to have brought back and made better. But the prophecy is one. I think that the contemplation of the prophecy of bringing balance to the Force would have been something that would have been a lot of fun to play with. And again, my comment always with it is it amazes me that Mace Windu, sitting in the Jedi Council, knowing that he is surrounded by thousands of Jedi Knights, or hundreds at least, this entire powerful Jedi Council, and that there is one evil Sith out there thinks that balance to the Force somehow means that evil is going to get defeated, or the Sith are going to get defeated. Balance means, that the Sith are going to get more powerful. And so I like that idea. I like the idea of playing off of that in the prequels. That is exactly what happened, is that balance was brought to the Force by making the Sith more powerful. The destruction of the Jedi Temple was what was, sort of foreseen in the prophecy. But then I think you could extend that and sort of say that in the later episodes, we effectively have the Sith becoming more powerful. In conjunction with the initial downfall of Vader and Return of the Jedi, we have maybe a little more breaking even, but at the same time, we still have Luke, unfortunately, now being the lone Jedi and being on the good side, and have really focused much more the idea of the last three movies being a question of what is good and what is evil. What is the Sith? What are the Jedi? And making it more of an individual journey. And I think we could have readily done that through children. I think the idea of, having it be, children's characters, having it be somehow related, would have been fine. So anyway, those are the kind of things that I think I would have changed. There's obviously a few sort of nitgripping small points I would have changed, but many of them, had I have gotten my way with these bigger ones, that would have never happened in the first place. I think there was a distinct loss of the fact that Captain Phasma was a potentially fun character that they did nothing with. There are a large number of characters that I think they didn't do anything with. I think there's also, and it's an unfortunate thing, I think, of movies generally, and particularly of franchise movies like Star Wars. I think there's too much focus on needing to introduce new characters, to introduce new toys, introduce new products in order to introduce new toys. It would have been nice to have seen a little more consistency. We didn't necessarily need a new, stormtrooper, being the First Order trooper. We could have potentially kept it as, hey, it's still the same iconic stormtrooper, maybe have some modifications. When we look at sort of the stormtrooper versus the snowtrooper, for example, in Empire Strikes Back, we could have had the idea with it. And again, I think just kind of keeping it as this little more coherent of a universe. I think jumping completely from the Empire into the First Order and making the First Order so powerful, and this sort of crazy, Armageddon way, they were too much of an enemy, for the New Republic. I think it would have worked better to have made it a little bit potentially, that, hey, they're more of an upstart. And something that, hey, we've got to deal with. They're dangerous, but, this is not we can go out and destroy things. We did not need to have them blow up Coruscant with a giant Star Killer base that resembles an overgrown version of the Death Star. We readily could have had that done by a terrorist attack, by a small group of people carrying out some kind of awful terrorist attack. And that being the resurgence. In some sense, it's kind of a little bit, I think, as to what we saw in Clone Wars. And the animated Clone Wars series and some of the plays in conjunction with like The Mandalorian, and things like that, and things that occurred during Clone Wars. Clone Wars focused, I think, on a lot more on smaller, engagements and smaller episodes, partially because of the fact that its scope, and it being, focused entirely on the Clone Wars and focused on small things related to it, if nothing else, for its teaching value. This is obviously a series designed for kids. And the very fact that, it gives a statement at the beginning, which is sort of the things you should learn, from watching this episode. But anyway, those are sort of my thoughts. In conjunction with, I don't know what Ben has to say. I have the feeling we may have some similarities. We may have some differences here, but that's my take. So anyway, I'll leave you guys with that. Total geeky episode. No law in this one, just talking about Star Wars. And again, we're talking about Star Wars because we always talk about Star Wars. So anyway, I will leave you guys with that. Hopefully you enjoyed this little edamame episode, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, so there you have it. That is what Star Wars, the Star Wars sequels 7, 8, and 9 might have looked differently, or might have looked like that would be different from what they actually did. If Kirk and I were in charge, I will be curious to hear what Kirk had to say. I'm sure he'll be curious to hear what I had to say. But I suspect there'll be similar types of things just based on conversations Kirk and I have already had. So at any rate, that's all for this episode. We've got a whole bunch of stuff kind of loaded up and ready to go here. Kirk sent me maybe a half dozen more little pieces of content. Not all of it is enough for a full episode. One of them that he sent me is like literally 2 minutes of him talking about something. But we'll be kind of putting those together and mixing and matching them, and trying to keep the content flowing here so that you have some stuff to listen to while we are still dealing with the COVID situation, which as of today, which is June 19, by the way, happy Juneteenth. And we will be continuing to get that out as we deal with this COVID situation, which is moving on, marching on, continuing to bedevil us. So hopefully we have one of those innovative COVID solutions Kirk was talking about in a prior episode soon. So that's all I've got. That's all for today. We'll see you next time. Lorem, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded in St. Louis, Missouri.